In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace your front knuckle. This is a loaded knuckle, so it comes with the backing plate, with the wheel bearing all pressed and ready to go. We just have to transfer this over. So let's get started. Let's remove the wheel, 21mm socket, remove all 5 of your lug nuts, and then pull the wheel off. Take the wheel off. Remove the axle nut. You need a 30mm 12 point for these fasteners. Keep in mind, they are pretty tight. And now you just want to make sure your axle pushes through the hub, which this one does, so that's perfect. I don't have to worry about it. If it doesn't, get a punch and a hammer, break it free because you don't want this to be seized up in here. When you pull the hub, if it is, it's going to separate the inner CV joint. Next, we have to take off the cotter pin that locks the tie rod castle nut. This one's fairly rusty, so it might not come out. If it doesn't, I'm going to have to put the socket right over it and basically spin the nut off with the cotter pin still in here. I'm going to try and break it free, but it looks like it might not happen. This is ready to break off of here, so we'll just get this off. And like I said, we're going to hammer a socket right over and spin the castle nut off that way. This is going to be a 17mm socket. I'm going to put the nut back on a couple threads so that when I release this tie rod, it doesn't just go falling down. It can be caught by the nut, and then we'll remove the nut. Hit the knuckle right here. That should break the tie rod stud free from the knuckle itself. That did it. Take the nut back off, and then we can pull the stud right through. Set this aside. Now I want to take the caliper off of the knuckle, and for that I need a 17mm socket to take off both of these bolts. Once you take one off, leave it in a couple threads to hold the caliper while you take the other one off. Once you have it off of here, make sure you hang it on the strut here so that it doesn't fall, and you definitely don't want it putting any pressure on the brake hose. At this point, we can take the rotor off. As a side note, I'm showing you on the new knuckle because our old one doesn't have it, but if you have ABS, now is the time to unplug the sensor. It's bolted on with a little 10mm bolt here. Push it out of the knuckle. If it's completely seized in here, you're probably going to need a new sensor. So keep that in mind. Again, our vehicle does not have ABS, so I don't have to worry about it. At the top right here, you have 2 19mm bolts that hold the strut on. Let's take both of these off. Hold the bolt side with a wrench. There's one. Leave the bolt in, and then take off the other one. Take them both out. Looks like the knuckle is kind of seized up in here in the strut due to rust, so we'll have to break it free. And to do that, just tap it with a hammer. Oh, or you can just pull straight down. At this point, you want to push the axle through as the knuckle comes down. We'll set the axle aside, out of the way. Now we're going to have to take the ball joint stud out of the knuckle. I have a new ball joint with a new cotter pin here, but a lot of times these will actually be completely rusted, and you'll have to hammer a socket on over the cotter pin and basically break it off that way, and then of course use a new one. Always use a new one even if it's in good condition, but what I'm trying to say is a lot of times it won't be this easy to remove these cotter pins. This is a 21mm nut. Take that off. Remove it completely. And this can get a little tricky here, but basically the knuckle is completely free. You just have to pull it up and off of this ball joint. And in order to not damage the boot, what I'm going to do is tap on the knuckle here, pull up at the same time, and naturally, as I'm tapping and pulling up, this should break free within a few taps. Just make sure you don't hit the boot or the ball joint. Try to aim for the knuckle here. There we go. And there's your knuckle with the wheel bearing. Now take your new knuckle, slide it down on the ball joint stud, pushes through perfectly. Put the nut on. Let's bottom it out, and then we'll torque it. In order to torque that nut, the knuckle has to stop floating around like this. So what I will do is not put the axle through because that'll prevent me from getting a socket on there. But I will put the tie rod stud back through, and that is going to somewhat hold it in place and prevent it from spinning, so I can tighten up that ball joint stud. So it doesn't have to be clamped on tight, just want to put this nut on so that it doesn't spin on me. 76 foot-pounds is the torque for this. That's it right there. Now we have to line up the cotter pin slot with the castle nut so we can actually put the cotter pin through. To do that, always keep tightening and never loosen. Slide the cotter pin through and bend it over to lock it in. Okay, make sure it's pressed down all the way because you don't want this to contact the axle boot and tear it. At this point, you want to make sure you have anti-seize on the splines of the axle. Mine has some, but I will add a little bit more just because I want to prevent it from seizing inside the knuckle. Take the axle and slide it through. Make sure it all lines up correctly. If it doesn't, just give the hub a spin to line up the splines. Bring the knuckle, line it up with the strut, and slide the bolts through. Remember, they went in back to front. Put the mounting nuts on, we'll bottom them out and torque them. Now these don't have any adjustment to them, so you don't have to worry about this. Sometimes certain cars will have adjustments, so I just wanted to mention that. That way you know that there's no adjustment to be done here. The torque for these is 113 foot-pounds. There you go. Now I want to coat the surface of this hub in anti-seize. I know it's new and not rusty, but this will actually prevent rust from building up here in the future. So wipe off anything that is on it. You don't want any sand or debris that might have gotten on it just from installation and you working here. Get all of that off, make sure it's a clean surface, and then coat it with a light layer of anti-seize. You don't want a lot because if you put too much, it'll start flinging out as you drive, and that is not something that you want. Also, try to avoid getting it on the lug studs because these need to stay nice and dry, clean threads so that your wheel can stay on safely. Now make sure this part of the rotor is clean. I have a new rotor, so I don't have to worry about rust building up here, but if you had rust, you'd want to clean it off, wire brush it, wire wheel it, sand it down, whatever you have to do, but make sure that there's no debris here. Otherwise, the rotor will not sit flat on this hub, and you'll have braking issues later down the road. So, slide the rotor on. In order to hold the rotor for me, I'm just going to put a lug nut on and bottom it out so it doesn't wobble around. There we go. That's nice and secure. Now let's put the caliper on. Take the caliper, slide it over the brake rotor, and line it up with where it bolts onto the knuckle. Put the two bolts in, bottom them out, and then we'll torque them. 79 foot-pounds is the torque for these two bolts. And two. Put the tie rod stud through the knuckle, press it all the way in so you can put the castle nut on, bottom this out, and now let's torque it. The torque for this is 36 foot-pounds. And now we want to keep tightening to line up the cotter pin slot if yours doesn't line up. Mine actually does. You can't see it because it goes this way, but it actually lines up perfectly. So I'm going to take my cotter pin, put your cotter pin through, and of course we'll bend it over to lock it in. Now let's put the axle nut back on. I'm using an impact gun for this, but I'm not going to tighten it with this. I'm just using this to run it down quickly, and then we'll use our torque wrench and torque it to 159 foot-pounds. To prevent the hub from spinning, I'm going to use my pry bar and stick it in here to hold it while I torque this down. Okay. Now you'll notice the axle has a cutout here. That's because we want to punch the axle nut in, and that's how you lock it in place. So take a punch and a hammer and make a little indent. Doesn't have to be a lot. This is enough to prevent it from backing out by itself. Now let's put the wheel on. Put back all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and then torque them to 76 foot-pounds. And double check them. And there you go, take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. the only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.